We'll come back to American Literature Class 8, but before we continue in Class 8, I would like to resume the discussion on modernism, which we started in Class 7. You cannot study American literature without having some knowledge about figures such as T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Faulkner, and Ernest Hemingway. Excuse me. Few writers have lived as colorfully as Ernest Hemingway, whose career could have come out of one of his adventurous novels. Like Fitzgerald, Dresser, and many other fine novelists of the 20th century, Hemingway came from the U.S. Midwest. Fitzgerald is also a very important novelist. He wrote The Great Gatsby, which is considered by some critics to be the greatest American modern novel. But let us focus with Ernest Hemingway. He was a journalist, and he was a writer, he was a traveler, and he started his youth as a paramedic in Spain during the Second World War, which gave him the experience that enriched his writing afterwards. Born in Illinois, Hemingway spent childhood vacations in Michigan on hunting and fishing trips, so he was a fisherman, as it were. He volunteered for an ambulance unit in France during World War I, but was wounded and hospitalized for 6 months. After the war, as a war correspondent based in Paris, he met expatriate American writers. Expatriate American writers who went to stay or to reside in Europe. And this can tell you how much Europe was influential on American writers. Remember Gertrude Stein, Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, all these for a considerable significant period of their time, they lived in Europe, because nobody can cut off his roots, and they believed in their gut feeling that they somehow belong to this place. In the first classes, we have mentioned that they wanted to be independent, but over time, they keep discovering and rediscovering their roots in Europe, because Europe is to them, is the haven or the enclave of philosophy, of literature, of enlightenment, of history. Okay? Ernest Hemingway, in fact, was influenced by Gertrude Stein for his spare style. What is his spare style? Spare style is the interest in writing short sentences, unlike William Faulkner, for example. William Faulkner was interested in writing lengthy sentences. Sometimes the sentence can be a paragraph long. And also he deconstructed the way grammar works. Remember the idea of grammar dislocation? William Faulkner was famous for this. Ernest Hemingway was famous for his short sentence style. Now we will come to the beginning of class 8, which is the American poetry. In this class, we're going to study traditionalism, Robert Lowell, idiosyncratic poets, and we will have Sylvia Plath, who also visited Britain and studied at Oxford University. And by the way, she got married to Teddy Hughes, the British poet. Now, the most important thing or invention or phenomenon that had humongous influence on this era of 1950s is the mass media. The mass media did not only expose people to new developments in technology and in media and in cinema and in television, etc., etc., it also exposed them to new ways of looking at life that was translated into new ways of writing in terms of form and content. We'll come to this. Now, traditional forms and ideas no longer seem to provide meaning to many American poets in the second half of the 20th century. Events after World War II produced for many writers a sense of history as discontinuous. History no longer a flowing stream that is connected. It is disconnected to them because, in their view, each act, emotion, and moment was seen as unique. Style and form now seem to provisional. Provisional means temporary. They serve you for a brief moment of time or a specific moment of time, and then you go for new style and new form. Makeshift. You keep changing things. You keep replacing paradigm with a new paradigm. Reflexive of the process of composition and the writer's self-awareness. The idea of self-awareness was very important. Writers contemplated and recontemplated their work every then and now in order to come up with new ways of producing literature. Familiar categories of expression were suspect. Originality was becoming a new tradition. Originality, what is originality? Originality in form, originality in content, originality in trespassing the rules established by your predecessors and creating new rules, creating new ways. Okay, this is the idea of originality. The break from tradition gathered momentum during the 1957 obscenity trial of Allen Ginsberg's poem Hall. When the San Francisco Customs Office seized the book, its publisher Lawrence Ferlingheit's City Lights brought a lawsuit. There was a case in the court for this poem and for this book that was subjected to censorship. It was prevented from being published, okay? During that notorious court case, notorious means infamous. That is famous, but in a bad sense. During that notorious court case, famous critics defended Hall's passionate social criticism on the basis of the poem's redeeming literary merit. Redeeming means it brings things from inside outside. It has the sense of confession, okay? It has a sense of taking what annoys you inside outside. Hall's triumph victory over the censors helped propel the rebellious beat poets. Please refer to the book in order to understand what beat poets are, okay? Especially Ginsberg and his friends Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs to fame. They became so famous because of the triumph of their case. It is not hard to find historical causes for this dissociated sensibility in the United States. World War II or II itself, the rise of anonymity and consumerism in a mass urban society, the protest movements of the 1960s, the decade-long Vietnam conflict, the Cold War, all these turbulent times, okay, gathered together in order to produce something that shocked the American culture in its depth, okay? All these environmental threats, the catalog of shocks to American culture is long and varied, okay? The change that most transformed American society, however, is the mass media, or the rise of mass media and mass culture. Okay, where people were exposed, where the widest number of people, or the largest number of people exposed to the largest number of media outlets, production, etc., etc. First radio, then movies, and later an all-powerful, ubiquitous television presence. With the TV, people became so crazy. Everything is on the show, okay, especially in America. And this, in fact, like an earthquake, changed America and American life at its roots. From a private, literate, elite culture based on the book and reading, the United States became a media culture attuned to the voice on the radio, the music of compact discs and cassettes, film, and the images on the television screen. All these formulated the American self-conception and their way or their perspective on the world. American poetry was directly influenced by the mass media and electronic technology. Films, videotapes, and tape recordings of poetry, readings, and interviews with poets became available. Yeah, it gave them a floor. The new technologies gave the poets a floor. And new inexpensive photographic methods of printing encouraged young poets to self-publish and young editors to begin literary magazines, of which there were more than 2,000 by 1990. You can compare this information revolution to what happened in 1424 when Gutenberg invented printing, which gave Martin Luther a floor to spread his word, okay, through the translation of the Bible, etc., etc., and that eventually led to enlightenment, okay? Now this is a turning point or a watershed in the American history. The American mass media, mass culture, all these came together to give the poetry of the time a new horizons of production and expectations. At the same time, Americans became uncomfortably aware that technology, so useful as a tool, could be used to manipulate culture. Yeah, it is a double-edged means. To Americans seeking alternatives, poetry seemed more relevant than before. It offered people a way to express subjective life and articulate the impact of technology and mass society on the individual. All possibilities are open, okay? A host of styles, a number of styles, some regional, some associated with famous schools or poets, vied for attention. Post-World War II, American poetry was decentralized. No center, no focal point, no established tradition, okay? Richly varied and difficult to summarize. Everybody writes whatever they please, okay? For the sake of discussion, however, it can be arranged along a spectrum producing three overlapping camps. The traditional on one end, the idiosyncratic in the middle, and the experimental on the other end. So we have three camps, as it were. The traditional one, and the idiosyncratic camp, and the experimental one. The traditional, people who wanted to cherish tradition, to abide by predecessors' rules in writing. Idiosyncratic, when you say something idiosyncratic, it has to do with personal choices that sometimes go against or are at odds with what is dominant, okay? Experimental, people who tend to experiment or explore new ways of writing, okay? William Faulkner was so experimental. T.S. Eliot was so experimental. Okay, these people are very, very important in terms of this. Traditional poets have maintained or revitalized poetic traditions. Idiosyncratic poets have used both traditional and innovative techniques in creating unique voices. Experimental poets, on the other hand, have courted new cultural styles. Traditionalism. Traditional writers include acknowledged masters of established forms and diction who wrote with a readily recognizable craft, often using rhyme or a set of metrical pattern. Often they were from the U.S. Eastern Seaboard or the southern part of the country and taught in colleges and universities. They kept to the rules, okay? This is why they are called traditionalists. Richard Eberhardt and Richard Wilbur, the older fugitive poets, John Crow Ransom, Alan Tate, and Robert Penn Warren, such accomplished younger poets as John Hollander and Richard Howard, and the early Robert Lowell are examples of traditionalist writers. In the years after World War II or II, they became established and were frequently anthologized. When a writer is anthologized, he enters the anthology of literature, and this means that they are canonized, they are accepted to be part of the literary canon. The previous chapter discussed the refinement, respect for nature, and profoundly conservative values of the fugitives. Fugitives, people who escape, okay? These qualities grace much poetry oriented to traditional modes. Traditionalist poets were generally precise, realistic, and witty. Many, like Richard Wilbur, were influenced by British metaphysical poets brought to favor by T.S. Eliot. Yeah, it was T.S. Eliot who first, in the 20th century, unearthed the importance of the metaphysical poets. Okay? Now, Wilbur's most famous poem, A World Without Objects, A World Without Objects is a sensible emptiness. Okay? A World Without Objects is a sensible emptiness. Takes its title from Thomas Traherne, a 17th century English metaphysical poet. Its vivid opening illustrates the clarity some poets found within rhyme and formal regularity. The tall camels of the spirit steer for their deserts, passing the last groves loud with the sawmill shrill of the locust to the whole honey of the arid sun. They are slow, proud. Okay, tradition talks spirit, deserts, groves, sawmill. If you make a componential analysis of this, you can see how this is abiding by the rules of writing poetry. Traditional poets, unlike many experimentalists who distrusted too poetic diction, welcomed resounding poetic lines. Robert Penn Warren ended one poem with the words, "To love so well the world that we may believe in the end in God." Alan Tate ended a poem, "Centennial of the Grave Who Counts Us All." Robert Lowell is the most influential poet of the period. Began traditionally but was influenced by experimental currents. Because his life and work spanned the period between the older modernist masters like T.S. Eliot and the recent and traditional writers, his career places the later experimentalism in a larger context. Lowell fits the mold of the academic writer, white, male, Protestant by birth, well-educated and linked with the political and social establishment. He was a descendant of the respected Boston Brahmin family that included the famous 19th century poet James Russell Lowell and a 20th century president of Harvard University. Now, done with traditionalists, we move to idiosyncratic poets. Poets who developed unique styles, unique personal styles, drawing on tradition but extending it into new realms with a distinctively contemporary flavor, in addition to Plath and Sexton, including John Berryman, Theodore Rothik, Richard Hugo, Philip Levine, James Dickey, Elizabeth Bishop, and Adrienne Rich. Sylvia Plath lived an outwardly exemplary life, attending Smith College on scholarship, Smith College at Oxford University, and graduating first in her class and winning a Fulbright grant to Cambridge University in England. Sorry, Smith College in America, and I mistaken Oxford for Cambridge. She studied at Cambridge, okay, in England. There she met her charismatic husband-to-be, poet Teddy Hughes, with whom she had 2 children and settled in a country house in England. You can see this connection between America and Britain in literature, okay? Sylvia Plath, an American girl coming to Cambridge, studying in England, and getting married to a famous poet such as Teddy Hughes. Beneath the fairy tale success feasted unresolved psychological problems evoked in her highly readable novel, The Bell Jar. Some of these problems were personal, while others arose from her sense of repressive attitudes toward women in the 1950s. Among these were the beliefs shared by many women themselves that women should not show anger or ambitiously pursue a career and instead find fulfillment in tending their husbands and children. Professionally successful women like Plath felt that they lived a contradiction, how they can reconcile between their ambition and the tradition that makes them submissive to their husbands. Plath's storybook life crumbled when she and Hughes separated, and she cared for the young children in a London apartment during a winter of extreme cold. Isolated and in despair, Plath worked against the clock to produce a series of stunning poems before she committed suicide by gassing herself in her kitchen. These poems were collected in the volume Ariel 2 years after her death. Robert Lowell, who wrote the introduction, noted her poetry's rapid development from the time she and Anne Sexton had attended his poetry classes in 1958. Plath's early poetry is well crafted and traditional, but her late poems exhibit a desperate bravura and proto-feminist cry of anguish. In The Applicant, Plath exposes the emptiness in the current role of wife who is reduced to an inanimate it. A living doll everywhere we look. It can sew, it can cook, it can talk. It works, there is nothing wrong with it. You have a whole, it's politics, okay? You have an eye, it is an image. My boy, it's your last resort. Will you marry it? Marry it, marry it. Remember, she reduced a human being into it, like any inanimate object. She is very resentful, she is angry, and she, in fact, may be lamenting her life. For now, I would like to thank you for your follow-up. Please sit down again on chapter 7 and read about these writers. There are certain elements I didn't mention simply because of the time frame we are giving in the studio here. I want you to go and focus on modernism. Next time I'm going to wrap up these schools and giving an overall class on American literature so that we can continue and do study Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn as designed in the course outline. For now, thank you and see you next time. Bye-bye.